Welcome to the book Boundaries. When to Say Yes, How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. This book has helped millions of people regain control over their lives by teaching one simple but powerful truth. You are responsible for your own life. But what does that mean? Does being responsible for your life mean you stop loving people, helping them, or being available to those you care about? Absolutely not. Instead, Boundaries teaches that healthy relationships, personal freedom, and true spiritual growth are only possible when you understand where your responsibilities end and where someone else's begin. In this book, authors take you on a practical, relatable journey. They start by showing you how life looks when you don't have boundaries, when you say yes to everything, feel responsible for everyone's problems, and allow guilt, fear, or manipulation to control you. They show you that this is not only exhausting, it's actually unbiblical. God created you to take ownership over your life, your feelings, your time, and your responsibilities, while respecting others' rights to do the same. Boundaries has 3 parts. What are boundaries, boundary conflicts, and developing healthy boundaries? Across these 16 chapters, you'll meet real people like Sherry, whose lives are overwhelmed by other people's demands. You'll discover biblical truths about self-control, responsibility, and love. You'll also learn practical tools for standing up for yourself, whether with family, friends, your spouse, your children, or even at work. This is not a book about building walls. It's a book about learning when to open the gate and let people in, and when to close it for your own health and safety. Whether you've been overwhelmed by needy people, pressured into saying yes when you mean no, or feel stuck in guilt or resentment, this book offers freedom, the freedom God designed you to live in. Let's start by exploring Part 1. What are boundaries? Part 1. What are boundaries? Chapter 1. A Day in a Boundaryless Life, Sherry's Story. Authors open with a relatable story about Sherry, a woman who has no boundaries. Sherry's day is a whirlwind of other people's demands. Her boss needs a last-minute report. Her son's teacher calls about his behavior. Her friend Lois is having another crisis, and her mother drops by unannounced, using guilt to extend her visit. Sherry feels constantly stretched, exhausted, and resentful, yet guilty for even feeling that way. The authors use Sherry's story to paint a vivid picture of what happens when you lack boundaries. They show how Sherry's life is not her own. It belongs to everyone else. From the moment her alarm rings to the time her husband falls asleep ignoring her, Sherry is torn in a million directions, trying to please everyone while losing herself. Authors explain that Sherry's problem isn't laziness or lack of effort, or even lack of love. Her problem is a lack of clear boundaries. She can't say no. She feels responsible for everyone's happiness, from her demanding boss to her needy friend to her critical mother. Her spiritual confusion only makes it worse. She believes being a good Christian means never saying no and always putting herself last. The authors emphasize that boundaries are biblical. They quote Genesis, where God gave Adam and Eve dominion over creation, showing that responsibility is part of God's design. They explain how poor boundaries not only exhaust Sherry, but also damage her relationships, especially with her children and husband. The chapter ends with the authors posing key questions. Can you love others and set limits? What does the Bible say about boundaries? How do boundaries work in daily life? This sets the stage for the rest of the book, where they teach that love and boundaries are not opposites, they are partners. Chapter 2. What does a boundary look like? In this chapter, authors introduce the concept of boundaries using a real-life counseling story. A couple comes to the authors asking them to fix their irresponsible son. The parents pay for his school, housing, and everything else, yet the son continues to fail, party, and avoid responsibility. The authors explain that the son doesn't have a problem, the parents do. By removing all natural consequences from their son's actions, they have taken his problems onto themselves. They water his lawn, while their own is withering. Their lack of boundaries is not love, it's enabling. The authors teach that boundaries are like property lines. Just like your yard has a fence marking where your land ends and your neighbor's begins, your life needs boundaries marking where your responsibilities end and someone else's begin. This applies to feelings, actions, beliefs, and even relationships. They introduce the good in, bad out principle. Healthy boundaries protect what is valuable inside you, your feelings, thoughts, talents, while keeping out what is harmful, other people's guilt, manipulation, or irresponsibility. They emphasize that boundaries are not walls. They are fences with gates. You can open them to let love in and close them to keep harm out. They introduce key biblical truths. We are responsible to others, not for others. We are called to carry our own load, but help carry each other's extreme burdens, Galatians 6. God himself has boundaries. He allows consequences, limits evil, and does not force us to obey him. They also list examples of boundaries in daily life, such as skin, physical limits, what touch is acceptable. Words, saying no or I can't. Time, choosing how you spend your day. Emotional distance, stepping back from unsafe people. Consequences, allowing people to feel the results of their choices. They stress that setting boundaries is not mean, it is loving and biblical. God himself sets boundaries with us, and healthy people respect boundaries in relationships. Learning to say no, when needed, frees you to say a joyful yes to what God has truly called you to do. Chapter 3, Boundary Problems. In this chapter, authors introduce us to 4 primary types of boundary problems, and they do it through the stories of real people. The kinds of people you and I know in real life. First, we meet compliance. These are the people who can't say no. Compliance are driven by guilt, fear of hurting others, and a belief that saying no is selfish. Authors tell the story of Cindy, a woman who runs herself ragged trying to please her demanding friends, her boss, her family, and even people she barely knows. Cindy's life is controlled by the fear that if she says no, people will reject her, and she'll be all alone. Compliance confused boundaries with being unloving. They grew up in families where disagreement was punished, or where expressing personal needs was called selfish. So they became people pleasers, losing themselves in the process. Next, we meet avoidance. These are the people who can't say yes. Avoidants are so afraid of needing anyone that they cut themselves off from receiving help, comfort, or care. Authors tell us about Marion, a woman who was abused as a child. To survive, Marion built emotional walls so high that even loving people couldn't get in. Avoidants think boundaries mean keeping everyone out, but they fail to realize God made us to need help from others. The third type is controllers, people who can't hear no. Controllers push, manipulate, or even bully their way into others' lives. They refuse to accept others' limits and constantly try to take over. The authors describe Stan, who never takes no for an answer. If a friend refuses to lend him money, Stan either argues, guilt trips, or finds another way to get what he wants. Controllers don't respect other people's boundaries, often because they were never taught to accept limits themselves. Finally, there are non-responsives, people who don't hear yes. They fail to take responsibility for their own needs and expect others to do the work for them. The authors describe Bob, who leans on his wife for all his emotional, spiritual, and financial support. Instead of growing up and taking ownership of his life, he drains her dry. The authors explain that many of us are combinations of these types. Some of us are compliant avoidants. We say yes to others but never ask for help ourselves. Others are compliant controllers. We people please to manipulate others into loving us. The key takeaway: healthy boundaries require knowing when to say yes, when to say no, and when to ask for help. All 4 types, compliance, avoidance, controllers, and non-responsives, have broken boundaries that block real love and real responsibility. By facing these patterns honestly, we can start building healthier, more honest relationships. Chapter 4, How Boundaries Are Developed. Authors believe that to understand our current boundary struggles, we have to look at where those struggles started, in childhood. This chapter takes us deep into the process of how boundaries form, or fail to form, in the early years of life. They begin with the concept of bonding, the first emotional connection a baby has with its parents. A securely bonded child feels safe and loved. From this secure base, the child gradually learns separateness, that they are a person distinct from their parents. This awareness is the foundation of boundaries. The authors tell us about Tina, a woman whose mother dismissed her feelings and needs as selfish. Whenever Tina cried, her mother shamed her. Over time, Tina learned that having needs was bad, so she buried them. As an adult, Tina struggles to say what she wants, even to her husband or closest friends. Authors break down 6 key stages of boundary development. Bonding, Birth to 1 year, learning to trust that the world is safe, that someone will come when they cry. Separation and individuation. Ages 1 to 3, toddlers learn no and mine. Healthy parents celebrate this, because it means the child is developing a sense of self. The no stage. Ages 2 to 3, children test limits. When parents respect their child's no while holding appropriate limits, they teach the child that both self-control and boundaries are good. The development of responsibility. Ages 4 to 5, kids learn they have their own choices and responsibilities. The comparison stage. Ages 6 to 11, children compare themselves to others and begin to internalize healthy or unhealthy standards. The adolescence stage. Ages 12 to 18, teens experiment with independence, testing whether their parents respect their growing sense of self. The authors emphasize that boundary injuries happen when parents fail to respect a child's separateness or over-control them, or, on the flip side, neglect them entirely, leaving them emotionally alone. The good news is, even if your boundaries were damaged in childhood, you can repair them now. By recognizing where your boundaries went wrong, you can grieve those losses, confront old patterns, and learn healthy ways to connect and separate as an adult. Chapter 5, 10 Laws of Boundaries. In this chapter, authors introduce 10 essential laws of boundaries, drawn from both scripture and psychology. They want you to see that boundaries aren't arbitrary rules. They are woven into the very fabric of how God made the world to work. The 10 laws. The law of sowing and reaping. Actions have consequences. When we rescue people from their own consequences, we interfere with God's natural order. The law of responsibility. We are responsible for ourselves, but to others. Love helps others with their genuine burdens, but never takes over their daily responsibilities. The law of power. You don't have the power to change others, but you do have power over your own choices, feelings, and limits. The law of respect. If we want others to respect our boundaries, we must respect theirs, even when we disagree. The law of motivation. Real love comes from freedom, not fear, guilt, or obligation. The law of evaluation. Saying no hurts sometimes, but healthy boundaries help everyone grow, even if it's uncomfortable. The law of proactivity. Setting boundaries proactively, not just when you're overwhelmed, creates healthier relationships. The law of envy. Envy focuses on what others have. Healthy boundaries focus on what God has given you to manage. The law of activity. Passive people avoid setting boundaries, but mature people take action to protect their time, energy, and heart. The law of exposure. Healthy boundaries must be communicated openly, not hinted at, resented, or assumed. The authors teach that God's world works through cause and effect, respect, honesty, and self-control. When you violate these laws, whether by over-rescuing others, hiding your needs, or demanding others meet them, you create confusion, resentment, and pain. When you follow them, freedom and love grow side by side. Chapter 6, Common Boundary Myths. Authors open this chapter by explaining why so many people, especially Christians, struggle with guilt, fear, and confusion when they even think about setting boundaries. They have absorbed myths about boundaries, false ideas that make them believe boundaries are unloving, unspiritual, or selfish. The authors introduce 6 common myths, and each one is rooted in misunderstanding biblical principles. Myth 1. Boundaries are selfish. Many believe that setting limits means you only care about yourself. The authors tell the story of Helen, who constantly said yes at church. When asked to volunteer for one more ministry, she felt overwhelmed, but she didn't want to appear selfish, so she said yes. Eventually, Helen burned out completely and had to step away from all service. Authors explain that true self-care isn't selfish, it's stewardship. God gave you time, energy, and gifts, and He expects you to manage them well. Saying no protects your ability to say a joyful yes to the things that truly matter. Myth 2. Boundaries mean disobedience. Some believe that saying no to any request is rebellion against God's call to love and serve. The authors clarify that God calls us to love others, not to rescue them from their responsibilities. Even Jesus set boundaries, withdrawing from crowds to rest, saying no to demands that weren't part of His mission. True obedience includes saying no when needed. Myth 3. Boundaries hurt others. This myth says that if you set a boundary, you will automatically hurt someone. But authors explain that truth can be uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean it's harmful. They tell the story of Karen, who was afraid to confront her manipulative friend, fearing it would hurt their friendship. But by staying silent, Karen allowed resentment to grow. Biblical love includes honesty. Proverbs 27 verse 6 says, "Wounds from a friend can be trusted." Sometimes a loving boundary is exactly what someone needs to grow. Myth 4. Boundaries mean I'll be abandoned. This myth plays on deep fears, the idea that if you say no, people will leave. The authors explain that healthy relationships can withstand honest boundaries. Relationships built on fear or control aren't truly loving. They share stories of clients who found deeper, more authentic friendships after they stopped people-pleasing. Myth 5. Boundaries mean anger. Some people fear that if they start setting limits, they'll become angry. Bitter people. Authors explain that anger is a signal, not a sin. When you've allowed people to violate your boundaries for years, it's natural to feel angry at first. But as you set clear, loving limits, that anger dissipates. Myth 6. Boundaries cause guilt. Many fear that saying no will make them feel guilty. The authors stress that guilt isn't proof you're wrong. It's often evidence of unhealthy training. As you retrain your conscience with biblical truth, you can let go of guilt and embrace freedom. This chapter reassures us, boundaries are not selfish. They are healthy, biblical, and necessary for real love and responsibility. Part 2. Boundary conflicts. This section dives into the real-life relationships where boundary issues show up most, with family, friends, spouses, children, work, and even God. Authors show how to navigate these conflicts with love, truth, and firmness, so you can protect your time, energy, and heart while still nurturing healthy connections. Chapter 7. Boundaries in your family. Authors say it bluntly, most boundary problems start in the family you grew up in. This chapter explores how early family dynamics shape our ability to say yes and no as adults. The authors open with an all-too-familiar scene, a grown adult dreading her parents' visit. Every time they come over, they criticize her parenting, rearrange her furniture, and make her feel like a helpless child again. She's a successful, independent woman, except around her family. Sound familiar? The authors explain that our first lessons about boundaries happen at home. Families either respect and nurture separateness, or they control, guilt-trip, or neglect, all of which damage healthy boundary formation. Types of families with boundary problems. The enmeshed family. In enmeshed families, there's no room for individuality. Everyone is expected to think, feel, and act the same way. If you try to step out, you're labeled selfish or rebellious. Authors describe Maria, whose mother calls her every day to check on her, and gets hurt if Maria has her own plans. Maria's life isn't hers, it's still her mother's. The detached family. In detached families, no one connects emotionally. There are no clear boundaries because everyone's isolated. The authors tell the story of Ben, who was left to figure everything out on his own as a child. As an adult, he has no sense of where connection ends and self-protection begins. The controlling family. In these families, love is given only if you comply. Disobedience, or even independent thinking, is met with guilt, anger, or rejection. Authors share about and whose father dictated every decision from college to career. Now, and struggles to make choices without external approval. The non-responsive family. In these families, needs are ignored. Children learn not to ask for help because no one responds. As adults, they become either too needy or rigidly self-sufficient. Breaking free. Authors emphasize that God designed family to nurture independence, not squash it. Even Jesus said, "A man shall leave his father and mother," Genesis 2 verse 24. Leaving doesn't mean cutting off, it means owning your life. Healthy families allow freedom, the freedom to say no, to disagree, to choose your own path. Dysfunctional families demand loyalty at the cost of individuality. The authors offer practical tools. Practice loving honesty. Share your feelings without blaming. Set small, consistent limits. Expect resistance, but hold your ground. Build a support network outside the family to strengthen your resolve. The good news? God can heal family wounds and help you develop the boundaries your family couldn't teach. Chapter 8. Boundaries in your friends. Friendships are supposed to be mutual and life-giving, but in this chapter, Authors show how lack of boundaries can turn friendships into draining, destructive relationships. The chapter opens with the story of Joan, a woman whose friendship with Lisa began wonderfully. They shared interests, supported each other through tough times, and truly enjoyed each other's company. But over time, Joan noticed that Lisa began to demand more and more of her time. If Joan had plans with other friends, Lisa would guilt-trip her. When Joan was busy with work, Lisa would accuse her of neglecting their friendship. Joan felt torn. She valued her friendship with Lisa, but she also felt trapped, and even resentful. Every time she tried to pull back, Lisa's manipulative comments made her feel guilty. Joan wondered, if I'm a good Christian, shouldn't I always be there for a friend in need? Authors explain that friendships thrive when both people respect each other's freedom and limits. True friends give freely, they don't demand. Healthy friendships respect each person's time, other relationships, and personal responsibilities. But boundaryless friendships, like Joan and Lisa's, become controlling and suffocating. Types of unhealthy friends. The authors described several types of boundary-challenging friends, such as the complainer, always venting, never willing to take responsibility. The controller, expects access to your time and energy without limits. The martyr, uses guilt and emotional blackmail to keep you close. The rescuer, jumps into your problems uninvited, then gets hurt if you don't follow their advice. Biblical friendship. The Bible paints a very different picture of friendship. Proverbs 17 verse 17 says, "A friend loves at all times." But love doesn't mean taking responsibility for a friend's happiness or rescuing them from consequences. Real love means being honest, respectful, and present, without losing yourself. Authors emphasize that Jesus had boundaries with his friends too. He didn't let Peter's fear keep him from the cross, Matthew 16 verse 23. He chose his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, instead of giving equal access to everyone. Practical tools. Learn to say no kindly but firmly. Don't rescue friends from consequences. Set time limits on conversations and visits. Surround yourself with friends who respect your no. Healthy boundaries don't end friendships, they protect them. When friends learn to respect each other's limits, trust deepens, and the friendship thrives. Chapter 9. Boundaries in your spouse. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership where two become one. But does that mean losing your individuality? Authors say absolutely not. In this chapter, they explore how healthy boundaries are essential for strong, loving marriages. The authors tell the story of Sharon and Jeff, a couple whose marriage looked perfect from the outside. Sharon was always accommodating, always putting Jeff's needs first. But inside, Sharon was lonely, resentful, and exhausted. Jeff had become more and more demanding, expecting Sharon to read his mind, meet his needs, and sacrifice her own desires. Sharon believed being a good wife meant never saying no. Every time she tried to express her own preferences, Jeff accused her of being selfish. Over time, Sharon lost her sense of self in the marriage. Authors explain that love and freedom go hand in hand. Healthy marriages are two whole people freely choosing to love each other, not one person disappearing to keep the other happy. When one spouse sets no boundaries, the relationship becomes unbalanced. The more Sharon complied, the more Jeff took, creating a parent-child dynamic, not a partnership. Common boundary problems in marriage. No freedom to say no. One spouse controls the other's decisions, time, or friendships. Over-responsibility. One spouse takes on all the emotional and practical burdens. Lack of ownership. One spouse blames the other for their feelings or choices. Triangulation. In-laws or outsiders interfere, and boundaries with extended family are weak. Biblical boundaries in marriage. Ephesians 5 calls husbands and wives to mutual submission, not domination. Each spouse is responsible for their own feelings, choices, and spiritual growth. That authors stress that setting boundaries isn't rejecting your spouse. It's inviting them into a healthier, more balanced relationship. Practical tools. Express your needs directly, without blaming or manipulating. Allow natural consequences. Don't rescue your spouse from their responsibilities. Guard your individuality. God created you with a purpose beyond marriage. Seek support, especially if your spouse resists boundaries. A marriage with healthy boundaries is more intimate, not less. When both spouses freely choose to love each other, the bond deepens, built on respect and honesty, not fear or guilt. Chapter 10. Boundaries in your children. If there's one area where boundaries are critical, it's parenting. In this chapter, authors explain that teaching kids boundaries isn't just a parenting strategy, it's part of their spiritual development. The authors introduce us to Todd, a third grader whose teacher calls his mom, Sherry, in for a conference. Todd disrupts class, ignores instructions, and refuses to follow rules. Sherry feels guilty and helpless. She wants Todd to be happy, so she rarely says no. When she tries to set limits, Todd throws tantrums until she gives in. Authors explain that Todd's problem is not bad behavior, it's lack of boundaries. When kids grow up without clear limits, they don't learn self-control. They expect the world to revolve around their desires, and they lack the skills to handle frustration, disappointment, or delayed gratification. The purpose of boundaries for kids. The authors emphasize that kids need boundaries to feel safe and loved. Clear rules and consistent consequences teach them what is their responsibility and what is not, how to delay gratification, that their choices have consequences, how to respect other people's boundaries. Common parenting boundary problems. Giving into tantrums, teaching kids that no can always be negotiated. Rescuing from consequences, protecting kids from their own mistakes. Guilt-driven parenting, believing that saying no is unloving. Blurring parental boundaries, treating children as peers, not children. Biblical parenting. The Bible teaches that loving discipline is essential. Proverbs 13 verse 24 says, "He who spares the rod hates his son." Discipline isn't about punishment, it's about teaching kids to take responsibility for their lives. Practical tools. Set clear, age-appropriate boundaries. Follow through with consistent consequences. Distinguish between needs and wants. Model healthy boundaries in your own life. The ultimate goal? Raising kids who can say yes and no with confidence, to others, to themselves, and to temptation. Chapter 11. Boundaries in work. Work can be one of the hardest places to maintain healthy boundaries. After all, we depend on our jobs to support ourselves and our families, and that makes it easy to feel like we have to say yes to everything. In this chapter, authors dive deep into the boundary struggles of the workplace, showing how unclear boundaries lead to burnout, resentment, and even career failure. They begin with the story of Steve, a marketing executive who couldn't say no to his boss. No matter how overloaded Steve was, when his boss handed him extra projects, Steve would smile and say, "No problem." Inside, though, Steve was anything but fine. He was working late every night, missing family dinners, and feeling constantly anxious. When his performance started slipping, Steve blamed himself. Why couldn't he just work harder? Authors explain that Steve's problem wasn't a lack of hard work, it was a lack of boundaries. Like many people, Steve believed that saying no at work would get him labeled as uncooperative or lazy. But in reality, failing to set boundaries led to decreased performance, resentment, and a total lack of work-life balance. Common work boundary problems. The authors outline several workplace boundary problems. Workaholism, feeling unable to stop working, even when it's hurting your health or relationships. Inability to say no, taking on more than you can handle out of guilt or fear. Covering for irresponsible coworkers, rescuing others from their poor performance, rather than letting them face consequences. Blurred roles, taking on tasks outside your actual responsibilities, and neglecting your own work in the process. Biblical work ethic and boundaries. The Bible calls us to work diligently, Colossians 3 verse 23, but it also calls us to rest and respect our limits, Exodus 20 verses 8 to 10. Jesus himself modeled healthy boundaries at work. He focused on what the Father called him to do, not every demand placed on him. In John 11, when he heard Lazarus was sick, he didn't immediately drop everything. He followed God's timing, not human pressure. Practical tools. Clarify your job description. What are you responsible for, and what aren't you? Learn to say no professionally. I'd love to help, but I need to prioritize my existing projects. Don't rescue coworkers from their own irresponsibility. Prioritize rest and family time. Boundaries at work don't make you lazy, they make you more effective. When you protect your energy and focus, you can give your best work to the things that matter most. Chapter 12. Boundaries in yourself. While many chapters focus on boundaries with others, this chapter turns the spotlight inward, to the boundaries you set with yourself. Authors explain that personal boundaries are about self-control, self-discipline, and taking ownership of your choices, thoughts, and emotions. The authors open with the story of Amanda, a woman who constantly sabotaged herself. She made New Year's resolutions every year, to eat better, exercise, and spend less, but her commitments always fell apart within weeks. She'd blame stress, circumstances, or other people for her failures, but deep down, Amanda knew the truth. She didn't have internal boundaries. What are internal boundaries? Authors define internal boundaries as your ability to manage your own thoughts, control your impulses, take responsibility for your emotions and reactions, follow through on commitments to yourself. Without internal boundaries, life becomes chaotic and reactive, like Amanda's. People with weak internal boundaries say things like, "I just couldn't help myself," or "I'll start tomorrow." They struggle with procrastination, addiction, overeating, overspending, and explosive emotions. The biblical basis for internal boundaries. Scripture repeatedly calls us to self-control, a fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5 verses 22 to 23. Proverbs 25 verse 28 says, "Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control." Without internal boundaries, you are defenseless against temptation, impulse, and manipulation. Steps to build internal boundaries. Own your choices. Stop blaming circumstances or other people for your lack of follow-through. Admit, "This is my responsibility." Set small, specific goals. Big, vague promises, "I'll get healthy," overwhelm you. Instead, set clear, realistic steps. "I'll walk 20 minutes today." Invite accountability. Tell a trusted friend your goals and ask them to check in with you. Accountability strengthens internal boundaries. Confront the lies you tell yourself. Challenge thoughts like, "I deserve this," or "It's too hard." Replace them with truth. Practice delay. Impulse control grows when you practice saying no to immediate gratification. Rely on God's power. Self-control isn't just about willpower, it's about partnering with God's Spirit. Healthy internal boundaries free you to become the person God created you to be, self-controlled, responsible, and capable of true freedom. Chapter 13, Boundaries in God. At first glance, the idea of setting boundaries with God might sound wrong. After all, shouldn't we be completely open to Him? But in this powerful chapter, authors explain that healthy boundaries even apply to our relationship with God, because God Himself respects boundaries. God's boundaries with us. From the beginning, God created humanity with free will. He didn't force Adam and Eve to obey Him. He gave them the freedom to choose, even if that meant choosing wrong. God respects our right to say no, even though it breaks His heart when we reject Him. The authors tell the story of Tom, a man angry at God because he felt like his prayers weren't being answered. But as Tom and his counselor unpacked his story, it became clear that Tom wasn't actually letting God in. His prayers were one-sided, demands, not conversations. Tom wanted God to bless his plans, but he never opened his heart to God's direction or correction. Inviting God into your boundaries. Authors explain that God will not force His way past your boundaries. Revelation 3 verse 20 says, "I stand at the door and knock." He knocks, He doesn't barge in. It's up to you to open the door. When we set unhealthy boundaries with God, sometimes we block God out because we fear His demands will be too great. We believe He'll let us down. We project our experiences with controlling people onto Him. But the authors reassure us, God's boundaries are always loving and good. He doesn't manipulate, force, or guilt trip. He invites, respects, and calls, but leaves the choice with us. Practical steps. Examine your spiritual walls. Where have you shut God out? Invite God into your fears. Instead of hiding them, bring them to Him. Accept God's no's. Sometimes He says no for our protection. Align your boundaries with God's will. Ask God to help you set limits based on His truth, not guilt or fear. The chapter closes with the beautiful reminder that God Himself has perfect boundaries. He knows who He is, what He loves, and what He will and will not allow. As we learn to set boundaries in partnership with God, we step into freedom, trust, and true spiritual intimacy. Part 3. Developing healthy boundaries. This final section of boundaries focuses on how to build strong, lasting boundaries in real life, because knowing what boundaries are isn't enough. You need to practice them every day, especially when you face resistance, guilt, or setbacks. Chapter 14, Resistance to Boundaries. Authors start this chapter by saying, expect resistance. Anytime you start setting healthier boundaries, the people who are used to controlling you, leaning on you, or walking over you are going to push back. The authors share the story of Meg, a woman who decided to set limits with her critical, controlling mother. When Meg gently but firmly told her mother that she wouldn't accept unkind comments anymore, her mother exploded. "How could you do this to me after all I've done for you?" she cried. Meg felt crushed with guilt, exactly what her mother hoped would happen. This kind of reaction is normal, because dysfunctional relationships rely on no boundaries. When you start setting limits, it disrupts the old system. People who are used to controlling you will manipulate, guilt trip, or even punish you to get you to go back to your old, compliant self. Types of resistance. Anger. Some people respond to boundaries with rage, trying to scare you into submission. They may shout, sulk, or withdraw affection. Guilt messages. Others use guilt. "You're so selfish," or "How can you call yourself a Christian and say no to me?" Victimhood. Some play the victim, hoping you'll feel so bad for them that you'll cave in. Blame. They may accuse you of changing for the worse, becoming cold or ungrateful. Biblical response. Authors emphasize that Jesus faced resistance too. When he set boundaries, religious leaders called him a lawbreaker, and even his disciples tried to control his actions. Yet Jesus stayed true to his calling. Galatians 1 verse 10 reminds us, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God?" Healthy boundaries mean putting God's will above human pressure. Practical tools. Expect resistance, it's normal. Stay calm and firm. Don't match anger with anger. Enlist support, a counselor, support group, or friends who understand. Remind yourself, healthy boundaries are a gift to everyone, even if they can't see it yet. Resistance is proof you're changing the old system, and that's a sign of progress. Chapter 15. How to measure success with boundaries. Success with boundaries isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Authors know that setting boundaries can feel awkward, uncomfortable, and even scary at first. This chapter is all about how to know if you're growing. The authors introduce Dave, a man who felt like a failure after his first boundary-setting attempt went badly. He told his friend, "I need to cancel our plans because I'm overcommit," and his friend snapped, "What's your problem? You're so unreliable." Dave felt awful, but authors explain that the fact that Dave tried is a win. Signs of boundary growth. You feel fear, but do it anyway. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. Every time you say no, even if your voice shakes, you're building your boundary muscles. You recognize manipulation sooner. At first, guilt trips work, but over time, you'll spot manipulation faster and respond with calm firmness instead of caving. You take responsibility for your feelings. You stop blaming others for how you feel. Instead of, "You made me feel guilty," you say, "I felt guilt, but I'm responsible for that." You no longer rescue people from consequences. You let loved ones face the results of their actions, even when it's hard. You find new freedom and energy. As boundaries become part of your life, you'll notice more peace, better relationships, and stronger self-respect. Biblical truth. Growth takes time, but God is committed to your transformation. Philippians 1 verse 6 says, "He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion." Healthy boundaries are part of God's good work in you. Practical tools. Celebrate small wins. Every no is progress. Learn from mistakes. Every misstep teaches. Measure growth by your increasing freedom, peace, and clarity, not by others' reactions. Growth is slow, but with God's grace and practice, you'll become a person with clear, loving, and firm boundaries. Chapter 16. A Day in a Life with Boundaries. This chapter beautifully mirrors the first chapter, but this time, it's a picture of what life looks like with healthy boundaries. We revisit Sherry, the overwhelmed, boundaryless woman from Chapter 1. But this time, Sherry has learned to set limits, prioritize her time, and say no without guilt. When her friend Lois calls in crisis, Sherry offers support, but doesn't drop everything. When her mother visits unannounced, Sherry lovingly says, I'd love to see you, but today doesn't work. At work, when her boss hands her last-minute work, Sherry says, I can't meet that deadline without compromising quality. With her children, Sherry follows through on consequences, helping them learn responsibility. With her husband, Sherry expresses her feelings directly instead of stuffing them down. Sherry isn't perfect. She still feels twinges of guilt or fear, but she doesn't let them control her. And something amazing happens. Her relationships improve. Her friends, family, and co-workers begin to respect her more because they know where she stands. And Sherry respects herself. The payoff of boundaries. Peace, Sherry's inner life is calmer. Clarity, she knows what is hers to carry and what isn't. Freedom, Sherry has time and energy for what matters most. Authors show that boundaries aren't walls that shut people out, they are fences with gates. They protect what's inside while letting love flow freely. Conclusion, final encouragement, and ending note. As you finish this audiobook, authors want to leave you with one core truth. You are responsible for your own life. This isn't selfishness, it's stewardship. God gave you a unique heart, mind, soul, and purpose, and He calls you to guard and nurture it. Healthy boundaries allow you to love freely without resentment, help others without enabling irresponsibility, speak truth without fear, say no without guilt, protect your energy for the people and purposes that matter most. God Himself models perfect boundaries. He invites us into relationship, but never forces us. He lets us face the consequences of our choices, but always stands ready to welcome us back. Healthy boundaries aren't just about saying no. They are about saying yes to the life God designed for you. A life of freedom, purpose, love, and grace. The choice is yours. Let your yes be yes, your no be no, and your life reflect the boundaries that allow love to thrive. Thank you